Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Jeff Moonen.
And I am Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 164. And if this is your first episode of Fun and Games, welcome. We'll do our best to make you feel right at home and like you understand what's going on. We'll probably make some references to episodes that came before, but that just shows a more realized, living, breathing world. And it's really apt that you came, because today we're talking about jumping into a video game series not at its first entry. When does it work? What makes a good midpoint entry? And who does it right, I suppose?
Yeah, this was an idea that came in inspiration partly because we were lucky enough to, from 47PR, to get codes to review and talk about the latest in the Like a Dragon franchise, aka Yakuza, aka a series name in convention that's going to kill me one of these days.
Fortunately, this one actually has Infinite Wealth as a subtitle to it. Makes it easier to talk about,
Yeah.
but it does make it weirder to look up online, because if you're not careful about what you type, you just get the weirdest finance blogs.
Yeah, and we were grateful for the folks who are 47 to provide us with a code, and it made us think, is this a good entry point to the series? And then beyond that, it went, well, what makes a good entry point to this series and then other series like it? And we'll talk about the Yakuza franchise specifically in a little bit, but I think I want to set some ground rules first. So for one, we're not going to talk about sports titles, wrestling titles. Yes, there's a conversation there to be had too of where to jump in, but that's more, I think, about quality of life than narrative per se. I mean, if you're a wrestling fan, maybe, depending on whether you like modern wrestling, old wrestling, but for sure sports titles, it's less important.
I think the only way to make that make sense, well, because first I was going to be like, yeah, because one makes the sort of like media nerd jokes like, oh, the Super Bowl happened. Oh, the series finale for football this year kind of thing. Like, it's that level of whatever, you're right, quality of life. Wrestling would be the one where I think if you're trying to follow a particular wrestler or something, when do they get them right? But that would be about it. That's still stretching it. I think that's outside our purview.
Yeah, and then arcade games, I mean, I think there's something to be said about fighting games, but I would say most fighting game franchises, you can kind of jump in anywhere with the exception of maybe the modern run of Mortal Kombat games, because they do have a pretty strong narrative, but I also feel like even those, based on what I've seen, you could jump in anywhere.
Well, that's actually, I think, part of the point of arcade games.
Yeah.
You are meant to just walk in and play. Arcades were designed and built, the machines, the cabinets, not to be collected by people at home necessarily. So you have to be able to jump in at a moment's notice. You maybe watch the attract mode, or maybe you just go insert coin and off we go. So whether or not you understand the story of what's going on or whatever is a little more immaterial. Like, that's arcade by design.
Yeah, and I think for series like Tekken and Street Fighter specifically, there are definitely long-running narratives, especially in Tekken. But I would say mechanically, usually jumping into the most recent release will be the safest, with the exception of Street Fighter in my personal experience, because Street Fighter V for the longest time was the most recent version and one of the worst modern versions. And then now 6 is out and lauded as a return to form, and so you're definitely safe jumping into the most recent release. And I think there will be exceptions to this rule, and if listeners have exceptions, I would love to hear them. But broadly, I would say most arcade games, to get it out of the way, the most recent entry is probably one of the best entries. You know, running in games like Metal Slug and the like, it can vary. I know folks are really close to like 2 and 3 in that series, and X and Double X, because they were remakes of older versions. But I think broadly for those kinds of arcadey experiences, your Donkey Kongs, whatever, although Donkey Kong technically didn't get a sequel to the Game Boy, that's neither here nor there. A fact I will never forget, thanks to my co-host. I think broadly it's safe to say that most arcade games you can jump in anywhere. Even if there's a narrative, they'll kind of get you up to speed on the basics, and for the most part, you won't really feel left out, because like Jeff said, by design, they are meant to be bite-sized experiences that are quarter-fueled that you can just kind of jump into.
And they are meant to be communal experiences as well. A lot of older arcade games that were meant to be long form, like a Tower of Druaga kind of situation, were designed to be labyrinthine and confusing so that you could learn secrets from other people. But I think that you're right, that the latest one is usually a good one to go with. I'm thinking of, in arcades, I played a lot of Dance Dance Revolution, and you would probably have, what are your favorite song lists or anything else? But if you're just walking in, and I'm stepping on the arrows here, the quality of life updates that would happen are very useful, because I remember I started on third mix, and if you wanted to do any sort of alterations to how things scrolled or even hardest difficulty. You would have to type in button combinations with your feet. I didn't know them. And I just see people doing stuff and I'd hear stuff getting shouted. I'm like, what the hell? And I think with the sixth one, DDR Max, if you just held your selection button when selecting a song, a menu would pop up and go, how fast do you want the arrows to scroll? Do you want these arrows? Do you not want that? What color do you want them to be? You had a lot more of those settings, and that made it a lot easier. But also with only a few buttons, they've always had confusing stuff. But there again, you're around other people, and usually, certainly during the game's heyday or when I was playing it, there were always folks there. It's like, if you don't know what to do and the song's not going, you can just turn around and go, what the hell am I doing? And someone can help you out. So there is a little bit of, I think when we talk about this, how much hand-holding and how much help do you need from experienced players of a franchise? Those kind of throw off the idea of, oh, these make for a great entry point, whether it's story, whether it's mechanics, whether it's moments. There's a lot to consider.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also with arcades, those experiences are, like you said, by design, but there are definitely going to be anomalies to that. There are shooting arcade games that are very narrative focused. I think what the core of this conversation boils down to is narrative and how prevalent narrative is, because I think that's when you can feel the most out of place. I think mechanically also there is something to that as well. When we look at the broad landscape of platforming games, for the most part, most franchises, you can jump in anywhere. I think the pinnacle of that, and one of the biggest mascots in video game history, Mario, really, really shoulders that. I mean, there's the original Mario arcade game, Mario Brothers, which is just an arcade game. It's very much like any other arcade game. But when you get to Super Mario Brothers 1 and the Super Precursor, I don't know, whatever.
Prefix,
thank you, there you go. When you get to the Super Mario Brothers franchise, like the first couple of games have minor story, but like if you jumped into Mario Brothers 3, I don't think you'd be that confused. You might be if you jump into Mario Brothers 2 and then go on. Different for a whole different host of reasons,
different confusion, yeah.
But like I think for the most part, any Mario game is a good entry point for the platformers. And I think that the newest one, Super Mario Brothers Wonder, though I've not finished it, I've only gotten a few worlds in, I mean, feels like the best that 2D formula has been. We did do a side quest episode with Brian Shea about Super Mario World and how it's still one of the best Mario games ever made. And I would still push people towards that. But I also know, like friend of the show, Dave Jackson, played it for Tales from the Way Backlog, his Patreon show, and thought it was fine. He didn't love it. He didn't hate it. But like it was definitely, it showed its age if you're used to modern platformers, which is why I would point people to Wonder. But I think as a person who has the muscle memory for a game like Super Mario Brothers, it's very easy to go back to. But what I love about this franchise is that even though there's a narrative set up at the beginning of every game, if you know Mario saves the princess or Mario saves the kingdom, everything else kind of just falls into place pretty easily.
Yeah, they could do the narrative without dialogue, which showcases a nice, straightforward, this is just getting us to the levels. And I think it's very funny to watch, and I've mentioned this a few times before, I think. Some friends of mine, their oldest son is now 5 and has been gaming for a number of years now, and he loves Mario. Getting to see him play Mario games on the Switch, where as far as he's concerned, they're all as exactly the same amount of old.
Yeah.
Wonder, I think, is the first new Mario game that has come out in his lifetime, or certainly cognizant time. So as far as he's concerned, switching between them on whatever virtual console, they're the same thing. And he does have favorites, and he does typically play the newer ones, but that's because he likes 3D movement. But I've definitely watched him play through back at Super Mario 99 days and play a bunch of older side-scrolling stuff. So that's a funny thing for, getting vindication as an older gamer that those games were good, and it wasn't just all we had. And it is a very funny support to your point, Matt, that, you can just jump in anywhere. You find the gameplay experience that you like with it. And that's what Mario's about.
Yeah, and I mean, I would argue that Donkey Kong's tryst into the platforming genre as well would be mostly the same. I think the original Donkey Kong Country games on Super Nintendo would be harder to jump into just because they are more difficult, whereas like Tropical Freeze, which is my favorite in the franchise and one of the most recent ones, I'd say is the easiest and most approachable. So there's a lot to consider when talking about an entry point into the franchise, especially if you're not going all the way back to the beginning. What are the criteria? And besides narrative, come up to speedness, for lack of a better term, a summarization. I think mechanically it has to be approachable as well, in the sense that, like, I am not a huge Dark Souls fan. I have only dipped my toe into the FromSoft landscape, but I would say that Elden Ring, which isn't Dark Souls but is in that vein, is the most approachable entry in the FromSoft games, because even though it's just as hard as the others, it's also got this massive open world where you can kind of level up running around the space. And I think that makes it a lot more approachable than, say, Breath of the Wild, which I think is also a very good Zelda game, but because it is so vastly different from every other Zelda game, it could be more approachable, could be less approachable, because a game like that relies on your knowledge of open world spaces, analog stick control, whereas the older Zelda games, it's a lot more basic, and so that might be more approachable, right? I don't know that there's a clear right answer mechanically. I think it's what the player is most familiar with, and also what is most easy to control, especially if we're talking about a young gamer or a gamer who's never played video games till the modern era.
I think the notion of long-running series doing slight genre shifts actually works in its favor for this very reason. If you have experience playing video games for any amount of time, none of us have played every game, none of us have played every single franchise, none of us have played every single genre even, but we have what we gravitate towards and we have what we favor. I remember playing Dynasty Warriors 2 way back when it came out on the PS2 with friends, and some of my friends got way more into Dynasty Warriors than me. I liked it, I thought it was cool, but around the time that I finally got my own PS2, which was college, I didn't care as much, or I had other games that I was focusing on. It just sort of fell by the wayside, and Musou games always felt like a bit much. But then, speaking of Zelda, Hyrule Warriors happened. And it's very much a Musou game in the more classic sense, or more what you think of when you say that, versus, say, Persona 5 Strikers. But Hyrule Warriors is also a Zelda game. And it had the characters, it had the trappings, it had those little landmarks and pieces so that I could play the genre by knowing the franchise. And you could do the same sort of thing in Breath of the Wild, where if you weren't necessarily about the lock and key, one solution only kind of adventure game, say, that Zelda was, or if you were someone that heard more what people said about stuff like Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword and were like, they sound good, but it just sounds like it's coasting by on its own reputation and I don't know, or whatever else. But if you like open world gaming and Breath of the Wild comes out and people are losing their minds over it, all these factors in place, but in a more hypothetical way or more in a vacuum, if you enjoy open world games, well, try the Zelda one as well. And that will get you into it. And if you want to go back and play more, cool. If it just makes you excited for Tears of the Kingdom, well, we were all excited for Tears of the Kingdom, and it got more open world, way more experimental in that way. And so your foray is rewarded as well. So this is handy. I mean, to the point of, and I think we're going to keep touching on Like a Dragon lightly throughout here, this is one of the other big points that got Matt and I talking about this. Matt is a very on-record, huge fan of the Yakuza Like a Dragon series. Just top to bottom, across the board. And I look forward to getting into the Kiryu Kazuma games. But my first entry to play was Yakuza Like a Dragon 7. That was a mainline title that didn't have Kiryu as the main character. It was Ichiban Kasuga, who's also the main character, or mainish, in Infinite Wealth. With a new protagonist also came a shift to turn-based RPG combat rather than elevated beat-em-up. Action RPG beat-em-up is how I would characterize the Kiryu titles. Please contradict me there, Matt, if I'm wrong. That shift was enough to not only get me to play it, but also to get my partner to play it. Sarah isn't exactly as much of a beat-em-up player as me. We played through a bit of River City Girls, but even that kind of a thing is she loved the design. It wasn't her kind of game. And so she was like, okay, no, Matt loves the series, and this does seem very cool, and the mini games look incredible. I love mini games, but I don't know, Jeff. I don't know about this. And so it was just the right time, and it's what got us to play. And I think Sarah was more excited about Infinite Wealth coming out than me, which was incredible to see. I'm delighted, and I was ecstatic about everything about it. So that shift was enough to get us to look, because we could use the conventions we knew of turn-based RPGs, of a genre we loved and were well experienced in, to get into a story that we were also interested in. And because of those shifts, a new protagonist, a change in gameplay loop, they were ready for it. despite it being the 7th game in a series, that was one that has continuity and events from one entry to the next, not a Final Fantasy, each one's its own thing. They made sure that you could go into this and be just as confused as the protagonist. Because Ichiban Kasuga, at the start of Like a Dragon, is just coming out of prison for nearly 20 years. And so all of the events that have been going on in the series, he doesn't know them. And I didn't know them either. And it was very fun messaging back and forth with Matt of moments where like, oh, well, I'm trying this out and doing these things. I feel like this is something, Matt, that you were excited about, but, I liked it too. Cool, cool, cool. And now getting to see kind of the continuation into Infinite Wealth has been very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about RGG Studios is that I don't think that was an accident. I think they probably wanted They probably wanted to make an RPG for a while. They probably wanted to transition the series out of beat 'em ups just because it's a very limiting, I think, space. I love beat 'em up games. Innovation comes very slowly, I think, to those spaces.
And I think they lapped Shenmue enough.
Yeah. But the thing is with Like a Dragon, the 7th game in the series, is that yes, it was a new protagonist. It was a new battle system. So, like, if you had any memory of past stuff, you were relearning along with the new players who were just learning. And I think that's really interesting. And I think what's really interesting about Infinite Wealth also is, like, I know folks who, as backwards ass as it seems, started with Gaiden, which is an interquel game, one of the last Kiryu beat 'em up games, at least it seems for the time, and then went into Infinite Wealth. That seems like it would be really confusing, but I think what's fun about these games and why narratively I think it's pretty easy to get into the new games, even if you haven't played the previous ones, is the story doesn't stop to explain stuff to you often, but there are ways to find those things. There is a mechanic in the newest game where you can reminisce as Kiryu. And it's cool for the fans of the franchise who love Kiryu because you get to relive these really stupid moments or really great moments via him reflecting. And if you've never played the franchise before or haven't had a lot of time with Kiryu, it's an opportunity to learn more about him. It may not be in a chronological order, but like there are little gifts there that are for the longtime players a reward for loving the series, and for new players a way to learn more about the series and go back and experience those moments, because often I don't think it tells you what game they're from, but graphically you can pretty much tell which game it's from, which is fun for me, just because Kiryu's face and like a lot of the character models have evolved over the years. But like I think that my ideal starting point for the franchise would still be Yakuza 0, because first of all, it's the start. And so if you never play another game after it, you've gotten a full, complete story. But also, I think all of the games are worth playing through. But it's a lot of time and it's a lot of investment, and which is why I'm kind of really happy that Yakuza Like a Dragon, Gaiden, The Man Who Erased His Name, and Infinite Wealth all seem to contain enough information that, like, and again, this is coming from someone who has played all the games, so I do have all the information, that you're likely to not be any more confused than other players are who are discovering the story, because another important thing about these games is that there's a huge twist in most of these games.
Oh, yeah.
You don't know when it's coming. And it always catches you off guard, unless you're more adept to parsing that stuff than me, but it always catches me off guard, at least. Those twists are a shock for everyone. New players, longtime players, those twists may have more of an impact if you know the history of these characters, but a lot of them often are just a twist to that current story being told. To be clear, some games it comes early, some games it comes late, some games have multiple twists. Like, I'm not spoiling it by saying this, but I am saying these stories always take a cool, dramatic turn. And even longtime fans of the franchise won't always see it coming. And I think that makes it unique to making just about any game a decent place to start. But I would urge that for a franchise like this that's so narrative heavy, 0 either at the way beginning or Like a Dragon, Gaiden, or Infinite Wealth, any of the new games are the best places to start. Starting in the middle of the Yakuza franchise is fine. They're all still stories that are kind of contained, but I think Yakuza 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, I think especially 6, really rely on what you know of Kiryu and of all of the clans pretty much that are in existence at that time. A lot of them are shifted by now. And so I think that makes a much bigger difference. But it's also fun when folks like Jeff and Sarah can get into a franchise that I've loved for so long. And by so long, I mean since 2020. I just played them all over the course of a couple of years.
Which is, when you play all of them like that, you're throwing yourself deep into it. You're exchanging time for time in a way, sprint for marathon. Yeah, no, definitely. It felt like, from what I could see, certainly around Yakuza 5 or 6, it was kind of struggling under the weight of its own continuity. And certainly in playing Like a Dragon and playing through Ichiban's story, you had kind of a mix of early on when Ichiban gets out of prison and goes back to his childhood home and finds that the building has been destroyed. And that could be on its own just sort of a, well, them's the breaks, and this is why my life sucks, and I got to figure it all out, and this is why I don't have these people. But it was also like some maniac drove a truck into the building and wrecked it. And I heard that and went, that had to have happened in a previous game. And yeah, Goro Majima was the one who did it.
Yep.
And it happened in one of the games. And that's a lovely reward. But as far as Ichiban's concerned, he doesn't need to know who did it. It happened years ago. What happens is what comes next. Whereas later on in the game, where Ichiban gets more involved in circumstances and events, and those cross over into circumstances and events of previous games or previous characters, and they start showing up, and they all get the very memeable intro to the names of the characters and how they're known, that very kind of whoosh and the name and everything else. I'm like, do I need to start writing these down? You are now cramming a lot of information at me. I just needed to know that the soapland was gone. Do I need to know who this guy is? Okay, the eye patch is cool. People really care about that guy. Love the tattoo. Who's that? Like, it just was kind of rapid fire. And I think that was almost a glimpse into why, for Like a Dragon 7, they did what they did.
And I think that there's a lot to say about why it's worth going back and also why it's worth diving in more recently. It's funny, we mentioned Zelda briefly before, and I think we should kind of pivot away from Yakuza for a bit and talk about the anthology franchise, because like talking about Zelda, Final Fantasy, and a few others, Shin Megami, these are all franchises where you could play every game, but you don't really have to. But does that mean every game is a good entry point? I mean, I think the short answer is yes. I think at that point, the long answer is depends on the gameplay you prefer, depends on the style. I mean, a lot of folks didn't like Final Fantasy 16. Clive has become one of my favorite protagonists in the franchise, and I really love the story of that game. Is it perfect? Far from. Is there a lot of BS in it? Absolutely. But I think this, what's considered a more modern gameplay mechanic of this kind of action combat that we see a lot in Devil May Cry and Hi-Fi Rush and Bayonetta and all sorts of other stuff, I think makes it more approachable to people who are interested in a fantasy world like that, but didn't know if they wanted to play turn-based or, ATB or whatever else. And I think it works. Do I think it's the best entry point? No. Do I know people who have played it as their first Final Fantasy? Yes. And for the most part, they enjoyed it. So I think something that we haven't quite talked about yet, an anthology series, or what really bring it to light, is preference. And you cannot anticipate for strangers' preferences. I can recommend a game to Jeff, and 9 times out of 10, it's a hit because I know Jeff's preferences pretty well. But complete strangers or folks who listen here who we don't know personally or really well, it could be harder. And so I would say for Final Fantasy and other anthology series like it, that might require more research. But I think also if you know your tastes and can do some research, there's still not a bad starting point with some minor exceptions.
Yeah, there are times where you have, okay, I need to recommend this specific person a game that I think they'll enjoy. Or there's recommending, if someone comes to one of us and goes, so what's the deal with Final Fantasy? Why do people like it so much? What game should I try if I want to see what the hype is about? Well, then there's other entries you can give for something like that. You can recommend Final Fantasy 14 if you want to be like, do you want to spend tens, hundreds of hours getting all of the history and everything while also playing through a game? Cool, go for that. Do you want to see the big watershed moment? Here's Final Fantasy 7. In fact, here's some remakes of Final Fantasy 7. Let's see if you get as hyped about it as those of us who played it in 1997 are. Final Fantasy X or any of these other ones, because they are anthology and you don't necessarily need all the history. Here's just an example of a game that people lose their minds over, take it or leave it. I mean, Final Fantasy VII was not my first Final Fantasy game, but we got so few of the previous entries in the States until after 7 came out and we started getting more things, and now we have the Pixel Remaster Collection, etc. I loved Final Fantasy VII. I still love Final Fantasy VII. But I didn't realize how strongly it took reference points from previous Final Fantasy titles. They always reference things. There's always repetitive elements, or whether musical motifs or creatures, monsters, little references. But playing through Final Fantasy V a couple of years ago, I kind of went, oh, wow, this is a prototype for Final Fantasy VII in a fantasy world and taking the piss a little bit. But seeing those is great. But you're right, anthology series, it's a little more of a come and go. And I think the more successful long-running franchises carry that idea because you need to hew to a certain amount of recognizability or something because you're always going to get purists.
Yeah.
But something that's easy to forget, and I often say about the Final Fantasy series is our example that we're using, that from the get-go, Final Fantasy has always been about pushing the boundaries of what the genre is doing, whether successfully or unsuccessfully. There's been a lot of times where there have been titles that have come out that after the fact people go, that was kind of a better game than I gave it credit for. Or, I still feel the same way about this. However, this idea, because they're trying stuff out. Has junctioning from Final Fantasy VIII shown up in other games? I don't think so. Certainly people don't talk about it. Or if they do, maybe it's that, but it's not the draw function or whatever it was that happened. But we do keep card games. So you know what? You never know in what direction it's going to go. And so Final Fantasy 16, yeah, if it's somebody's first Final Fantasy game, that's what the series looks like for them. It's not an active time battle system. It's not multiple characters working off of a menu. It's none of those things. So that's still Final Fantasy, and that's still great.
Yeah, I think ultimately, if someone has never played a Final Fantasy game before and they haven't played a lot of classic games, I would recommend one of the modern entries. I think anything after the Super Nintendo, even maybe anything after the PlayStation. I do think that modern ports of 7, 8, and 9 are the best versions of them. Mm-hmm. I would have never gotten through 9 if I didn't have the ability to make me do 909,000 or whatever it was, 99 damage to all enemies, which you can turn on if you're in a tight spot and can't finish a battle. Like those kinds of things, or like turning off random battles, things like that, quality of life upgrades that I think are really helpful. Also, what's fascinating about franchises like Final Fantasy and Zelda specifically is they're very different. So for Zelda, I have had a favorite Zelda that's only changed a few times. Mm-hmm. My favorite Zelda was A Link to the Past until I played Minish Cap many years later. And Minish Cap since has been my favorite, though Link Between Worlds is a close second. And then Link's Awakening, the remake version, I still have not to this day played the original, is a close third. I prefer the top-down games. I do love the open-world games. But like for me, that franchise has stayed pretty static, and I would recommend any of those games as a starting point. I think Minish Cap would be my top choice just because it's one of the more accessible while still feeling like the classic, but I think having the quality of life stuff that makes it a little better. But in a series like Final Fantasy, my favorite was 7 until I played 9, and now 9 is my favorite. But like I played 4 a few years ago and really loved it, and it's one of my top tier games now also. Like, and then again, 16 I really loved. 15 I started to replay a few years ago, and while I still haven't finished it on a second playthrough, I got much further and liked it a lot more than I did the first time. I think anthology franchises, the reason that you can't go wrong with recommending your favorite to someone is if you know the person and you can give why it's your favorite, right?
Yes.
I think that goes a lot more way than the game itself and what it offers, whereas in a case like a Dragon, the narrative is so intertwined that your recommendation may not go far enough, and why these kind of restart points in long-running franchises are also important, like Yakuza Like a Dragon, the 7th game in the franchise. And like there have been 9/10 games in the franchise at this point, you know, if you count the interquels and stuff. And then there are spin-offs, and like they play Dress Up in Feudal Japan for one of the games, spin-offs. Like there's tons of other stuff. Like a Dragon Ishin, which was a remake of a game that came out only in Japan that was a side story. I would recommend to people if they wanted a cool adventure in that time period. I wouldn't recommend it as my first Like a Dragon game, mostly because it's not the best of the beat 'em ups. It is pretty good, but it is not great. Like it doesn't have the sub stories that are really great. It doesn't have enough of the mini games that are really great. And I think when making a recommendation for someone to jump into something, what you can offer to that recommendation, I think goes a long way. But when it comes to what the game can offer, it is really the little things that I think add up that make things accessible for people, both mechanically and narratively.
Yeah, because this is something to keep in mind. As somebody who recommends games a lot and associates with many other people who are also excellent at recommending video games to people, we all go about it in a different way. And I think a crucial skill is sort of cutting to the quick of why it's important, why this is a good first entry, or why I'm recommending this game to you. Games with huge narratives, games with little to no narrative, sometimes it's not a big deal as far as, okay, here's all of the things you need to know about all of these people. I mean, listen, I am absolutely a freaking obnoxious pop-up video Amazon X-ray of playing through games and moments happen that are references to things. I have to always be actively not hitting you in the arm going, did you see that? Did you see that? Oh my God, no, that thing was a reference to all this that happened all that time ago. That's not necessary. What is the soul of the game as far as you're recommending it? I think, I wouldn't recommend Ishin for a first Like a Dragon because, it doesn't have the side stories in quite the same way. It doesn't have all the mini games. Is that the point of the Like a Dragon games? No. But it wouldn't feel like a full Like a Dragon experience, and certainly for I want you to see what the game's about. That is missing something. And it's kind of funny that sometimes we get into series at the most unlikely point in the game's through line. I mean, we were talking about some older games and platformers. Platformers, they'll have a story, but whatever's going on. I mean, Metroidvanias, those have a varying amount of story and dialogue. But also consider that with older titles, most of the time, due to space restrictions, you had to kind of piece the story together yourself, especially if you got the game used. And nowadays, you're getting most of your older games used or digitally looking up the instruction manual. Are you actually reading the instruction manual? You're just kind of piecing that together. So that's an easier jump off point. But a series with platforming that does have a story to it that Matt and I have gone very on the record of loving is Shantae.
Yes.
And if I remember correctly, Matt, your first Shantae game was the same as mine, Pirate's Curse.
So actually it wasn't. My first one was Half Genie Hero.
Okay, which is another great jumping in point, and I think they primed it to be so.
Yeah.
Whereas Pirate's Curse is, if you don't know the Shantae series, you are playing as the protector of a town who is a half genie, so she has some powers, light Metroidvania elements, but is largely a platformer. It's a side-scrolling game. You can collect some resources and upgrade some stuff. You get some items that you can use, all that kind of a thing. And there is a bit of a story. There's recurring antagonists, and there's a little bit of okay, we're just having an excuse to play the game. But still, in Pirate's Curse, Shantae she has been depowered. She doesn't have her genie powers, which allow her to transform into various animals, which is how she traverses and has that Metroidvania element of, I can't go through that tiny space until I can turn into a mouse, or I can't break that down until I can turn into an elephant. So Pirate's Curse, you have to find items to approximate these things. You're finding pirate artifacts, and I'm playing it on the 3DS, so I'm able to access all of my items and things using the touchscreen rather than any sort of pause menu. And by the end of the game, she gets her genie powers back. Spoiler alert, there have been several games that have been out after it, and so this is the one that is the most Metroidvania of the series, where all of them just have sort of light elements. It is one that is missing a crucial mechanic. It doesn't have any of the transformations, which one could argue is crucial to it. But the gameplay experience and what your goals are similar enough. And extra exploration is still rewarded in the same way. And so it's not as if when I played Half Genie Hero as my next Shantae game, I went, well, this is disappointing. Because it wasn't. And I felt like I was getting to come home to what the series was about, and I had a great time playing it. I mean, what was your experience starting with Half Genie Hero?
It did a pretty great job of onboarding. I mean, Half Genie Hero was the first Switch game, and Switch had the largest install base of any of the consoles that this game has been on, with maybe the exception of no, because it wasn't on the Game Boy Advance. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
I think that they made it really approachable. But when I did go back and play through the entire franchise, sans Half Genie Hero and the Game Boy Advance game that won't exist until later this year, early next year, I didn't really struggle as much as I thought I might. I mean, the first game is difficult for a whole host of reasons, but I don't think the mechanics are one of them. Although in the first game, you have to input your dances like a code to transform, which was a fun idea, kind of playing off DDR and that kind of thing. But they drop it pretty quick after that. But I think that Shantae, even being narratively focused, there is enough conversational banter to get you up to speed Like, all you need to know is that Risky Boots is the Bowser of this franchise, and then you're
Yes.
off and running. I think that Pirate's Curse is a good entry point, though, because, again, the gameplay completely changes a bit with how you do the things that you do. And then Half Genie Hero is also a good entry point because it's the first return to form in the modern era. And since we've gotten the Seven Sirens since then, that one also has similar mechanics to Half Genie Hero, though I'd say arguably is a better game. That makes this franchise kind of really work. It's kind of evolved with the times in a way that I think makes them all accessible, but definitely every game after the first one is the better game. The first one is, I think, worth recommending if you want to experience a classic Game Boy Color game that shouldn't be as beautiful and function as well as it does. But beyond that, it doesn't offer much that the later games don't offer more of. And it's funny, you mentioned Metroidvanias before. I think for the most part, most Metroidvanias, especially modern ones, are one-offs or are currently getting a sequel or only have one sequel. I'm thinking of Ori or Hollow Knight, put on my
Axiom
clown nose,
Verge.
Axiom Verge. Technically, Hollow Knight doesn't have a sequel, at least until we receive it, as I put on my clown nose and makeup.
One day.
Then there's franchises like Castlevania and Metroid, the namesakes. And Metroid, I would argue you could start with any modern game past the Game Boy. I think anything from the Game Boy Advance on is a good starting point. Super Nintendo game, and I got into some bickering online about this. The Super Nintendo game is great. Control-wise, it just hasn't aged as well as the later stuff. There's no reason to play the original Metroid at all, I think, on the Nintendo when a game like Zero Mission exists, and I recently was on Retro Hangover to talk about, because it just improves that game in almost every way and makes it way more accessible. Again, if you want an entry point where you just get a feel for how this franchise started, kind of irrelevant to this conversation. If you want the most accessible entry point, I think Zero Mission is still that, but like any of the newer games, because what Jeff was alluding to before, most of these games didn't have much of a story, with the exception of Fusion and a few of the modern games. And even still, there is not a ton of dialogue. Samus doesn't talk that much. The villains do most of the talking. And besides Fusion, where Samus has an internal monologue and there is a lot more dialogue, most of the franchises are just about ambiance, experience, and exploration, which makes all of them good entry points. And then it comes down to, do you want a 2D side-scrolling experience, or do you want a 3D first-person experience? Beyond that, any of them are worth jumping into.
Yeah. And I would even say that, yeah, there is definitely so much storytelling that happens in Metroid games, but it is all atmosphere. I would almost say, if I want to be cute about it, and of course I do, that there's so much storytelling, but there is next to no story talking.
Yes.
Very little telling you what's going on. A lot of things happen. Sit with it. What is it? And I think that's where a lot of Metroidvania titles live. Very light story talking. It reaches a point where dialogues that happen if they're all the time slow down the flow. Super Metroid is actually an excellent example. And we were not setting this up at the start of the episode. I didn't even have that in my notes, but you're absolutely right, Matt. Super Metroid is an excellent entry point for things, to the point where they almost assume you haven't played the first two games.
Yeah.
I mean, I played Super Metroid before I played Metroid 2 Return of Samus all the way through. And so they spoil the ending of Metroid 2 at the very beginning of Super Metroid, which is Metroid 3. And it came out in that order: Metroid, Metroid 2, Super Metroid. This wasn't a prequel situation or anything like that. But it was like, here's what you need to know. Went to this planet, dealt with some space pirates who are dealing with Metroids. Went to the Metroid planet to try to exterminate them. I did 99.9% of a good job there and got that last one out of there. Something went up. Here I go to check it out. God damn it, it's those space pirates again. Time to go back to that first planet where, again, if you've played the first Metroid, you could get this sort of like cool nostalgia reward for, oh man, yeah, that is exactly where the Morph Ball is. Or at the beginning of Super Metroid, you go through the final boss of Metroid's lair in the beginning of Super Metroid. So you have those moments, but if you've never played the previous games, you just kind of go, whoa, something happened here. And it just matches and meshes with the atmospheric storytelling. It's a great entry point, and one that I could argue, yeah, any of the Metroid games have a sliding scale of accessibility and controls, where Metroid Dread is very straightforward about what you're using, how you're doing, and any of the super advanced techniques are more for 100% completion than for actual progression, story progression. But they use every single button. Like, they really use every single button, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is up to taste. Super Metroid can also be a little confusing there, but some of the higher level stuff, again, it's not necessary. It's just if you're trying to find everything, which you could argue, what's your goal in a Metroidvania? Finish the game or find everything? That's personal preference, but I would say, yeah, Super Metroid kind of exists as an excellent example of, do you want to go back and play the previous ones? That's up to you. But this tells you everything you need to know, gives you great quality of life upgrades. I mean, it gives you a fucking map.
Yeah.
Happy day. Think of Metroidvanias these days coming out without a map. Like, talk about learning as you go. Oh my God. And they probably couldn't do that on the NES, not in the same way, not and get the same thing that they wanted when Metroid came out. The chips they had, the mappers they had, whatever else. So it's not like, they didn't get it. But, you find these things as you go, and that's fun to do too. It's probably why also Yakuza 0 is an excellent entry point for the series, because they'd had a few entries already. And so they knew what they wanted to tell, they knew what they wanted to fill in, and they had quality of life upgrades to make a strong entry.
I think with Metroid, also the reason a lot of games are a good entry point beyond Super is because they summarize the story at the beginning of every game. And because the game is storytelling and not story talking, as Jeff has coined, it doesn't take long to summarize because it's actions. And summarizing actions, I mean, Fusion summarizes all of its events before anything that came before it. And then same for Dread, which takes place after Fusion. And I think that, yes, having played all of the side-scrolling games and loving the numbered franchise entries, getting to Dread was an insane adrenaline rush. But for folks who haven't, I think you could still get just as wrapped up in the story just by getting the summary. Now, its counterpart, Castlevania, I would say, has a much shoddier track record for entry points. And part of the problem is that Castlevania doesn't know what it wants to be, and also Konami, who owns the rights to it, mishandles it more often than not.
If you ask Konami, they want to be pachinko machines.
Pretty much. They've made attempts at 3D games, and I would argue that the first 3D game, which you can most prominently, I think, get on Steam these days, what was it called? It was Castlevania.
Are you thinking of Lords of Shadow, or are you thinking of Castlevania 64,
No,
the
64.
actual first 3D Castlevania game?
Castlevania 64 should die in a fire. It is well, that's extreme. It's not a good entry point. Let's say that.
That's absolutely true. And I mean, not even on the console. They made Legacy of Darkness.
That's true.
Which, is it a good game? It's a better game.
Yeah. But I would say that Lords of Shadow is a good entry point because it is a retelling of the game. It's a reset.
It's a new continuity. It's a whole reboot.
And it's a 3D God of War-like that if you like those kinds of games, it's a good entry point for that very short series that actually has an interquel that's a Game Boy Advance game that's a side-scroller, which is interesting. Yeah. But I would say that most modern Castlevania the more modern games, the PlayStation On, Game Boy Advance, DS, 3DS, those are going to be the best places to jump in because I think Symphony of the Night is lauded as one of the best Metroidvanias ever. It's the first game in the franchise that really leans into the Vania, like Metroidvania of the genre.
It coined it, yeah.
Right. And so that will always be a high recommendation for me, especially since having played it recently, it has aged pretty well. But like any of the Game Boy Advance or DS games are some of the strongest in the franchise. They released a Game Boy Advance collection on the Switch and I think other modern platforms as well. That one is much harder to recommend. Like Metroid, I could say just about besides 1 and 2 on the original Nintendo and Game Boy, any entry you'll have fun with in Metroid if you jump in.
Yeah.
On some level or another.
And it's interesting that, in a way, Castlevania is, certainly in its classic continuity, an anthology series.
Yeah.
Because sort of like Legend of Zelda, where it's all one continuity, but you are playing different protagonists. You are different Belmonts or Belmont-adjacent hunters and characters taking down, destroying the knight, fighting the knight, whatever it was. And so, yeah, there's times where it's like, okay, don't play that character, don't play their entries one way or another. And by contrast, if I'm not recommending Symphony of the Night, and hypothetically you had access to every Castlevania game that ever came out, I'd say Aria of Sorrow.
Yep.
The last Game Boy Advance title and the first of the duology starring Soma Cruz. That completely breaking tradition of Castlevania takes place in the future. There's all sorts of things to deal with there, but has great mechanics, great story, and everything else where, some light dialogue scenes, none of them take very long, and they're all very clearly based around the boss fights, so that's a nice thing. But Yeah, you're right. Castlevania as a series jumped perspective, if not genre, an awful lot. And so it's interesting to see where that goes. And because your consistent characters are the villains and not the heroes, it's sometimes separated by centuries, decades, whatever amount of time, there's only so much you could do of like, yes, built on the grounds of this. As far as we, the players, are concerned, if it's our first Castlevania and characters are talking about stuff that happened hundreds of years ago, we're just as confused as the player character is, or we know just as much as they do. There's a very adorable moment in Castlevania Symphony of the Night. You're playing as Alucard, as Dracula's son, who has lived for hundreds of years and made a previous appearance in Castlevania 3, the last NES entry. And a character who is a young adult is looking for the modern of that time, Belmont. And so she asks, do you know the name Richter Belmont? And a little thought bubble shows up over her head that shows the sprite from the game of Richter Belmont. And Alucard just goes, the Belmont clan? Well, of course, but what, and he gets interrupted. His thought bubble pops up, and it's the NES sprite of Trevor Belmont, who you play as in Castlevania 3 that happened 300 years ago, which is referenced as that. I didn't play Castlevania 3 when I first played Symphony of the Night. I understood what the reference was, and it was a definite like, oh, older game, older things, that's hilarious. And that's all you really need to know from that. And I go back and forth on whether or not Symphony of the Night is the good recommendation of jumping into the series. I think it is, but I also recognize the growing pains of the Metroidvania genre and of the Castlevania, the Igavanias, the ones that were designed, that were directed by Koji Igarashi, who made a lot of those and was a producer on Symphony of the Night and took all of that to make Bloodstained, which is also an excellent game. What's a good jumping in point for Castlevania? Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Just the same as Super Metroid. If you can get past whatever those, or depending upon who I'm recommending it to, yeah, Symphony of the Night all the way.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I think Castlevania is a very strong series, but I would say it's a 50-50 series, maybe a 70-30 series, where like
that's fair.
hits and misses. And that I would be more cautious about recommendation based on quality of the games than anything else.
Now, Castlevania and any of those, as we talked about, are more anthology, a little more spread out. What about more tighter narrative games? So, Matt, I'm going to enter your area of podcast expertise here outside of this show. A lot of times when people start playing like the Mass Effect series, getting the Legendary Edition is great now, but I remember when I first started getting into the series, having kind of a lot of people going, you don't need to play the first one. And I'm like, okay, but the choices matter and there are consequences. If I play the second one and want to go back to the first one, from what you're saying, I'm definitely not going to be able to go back to the first one. So should I start with the first one and carry these things over? Meanwhile, I also played through Mass Effect 3 on the Wii U. And 3 is the only entry of the trilogy on the Wii U. And they do an excellent thing that Mass Effect does anyway. If you're not starting with the first one, they give you kind of a digital comic summary of what went on, and you get to make some crucial choices that carry through. It may not necessarily be as subtle of choices and consequences as if you played through the game fully yourself, but it covers those things. Matt, thoughts?
So, I mean, with Mass Effect, it's interesting. As far as the choices go, the major choices get knocked out by the comics that have come with both 2 and 3, released by Dark Horse and like published by Dark Horse. I can't remember who drew the comics off the top of my head, but yeah, it's a digital comic in the style of a Dark Horse comic. And you'll get all of your major choices that matter there and then can see them to fruition in 3. But all the smaller choices, side quests and that kind of thing, for the most part, get brushed under, or the game makes choices for you, like based on what's considered quote unquote canonical, even though there really isn't a canonical choice.
Yeah.
I go both ways. I used to tell people to skip 1 because the gameplay is mostly unplayable. But as I've gotten older, I've realized 1 is worth playing. Just play it on easy. If you play it on easy and manually save frequently, because also the autosave system sucks in the first game, you'll be fine. However, also with the Legendary Edition existing, that remaster did a lot to make the first game more playable, though there's absolutely no reason to skip the first one. With a series like Mass Effect, having only 4 entries and the 4th entry being a departure as it's in a completely different like galaxy and a different time period, I think that you could start with Mass Effect Andromeda, absolutely. And I think there's a lot there to chew on that someone who doesn't carry the weight of the entire franchise with them could really enjoy, in a similar way of jumping into Yakuza Like a Dragon. It's the same kind of thing. It's the gameplay is refined, the classes are changed and refined, and the characters are all new with some slight references to characters that came before. It's a very similar kind of jumping off point. But if you're going to play the trilogy, I highly recommend starting with the first one. Yes, you can skip the first one and start with the second one, which mechanically and I think narratively is one of the strongest entries, although I come around to really loving 3 as well, flaws and all. I do think that that's a series where you need to start with 1, but to the opposite end, bringing this up, Dragon Age, which is a franchise where you don't play as the same protagonist in every game.
Right.
You could start with any of those. I think 1 and 3 / Inquisition is the strongest starting points. In fact, I started with Inquisition before going back and playing 1 and 2, but ideally any of them will work because all of them give you the background and then you start as a new protagonist. There are references to the other protagonists, but they are not required. We'll see with Dreadwolf when it eventually comes out how reliant that is on Inquisition, because the villain of that game is tied to a character in the first game more strongly than I think other games have done that. But I think while Mass Effect really requires you to either start with Andromeda or the trilogy, I think Dragon Age, you can kind of jump in anywhere. Again, the arguments to be made for the Dragon Age games is kind of game, quality of game. As we play through the longest DLC in history, Awakening, for the first game right now on Reignite, I like the gameplay of the first game. Is it great? No. But is it bad? Also, no. It's not unplayable. I think also, again, on these older games, I'm playing on easy just for ease of stress and for coverage for Reignite. But
right.
I think that if you want a modern gaming experience and still want to see what Dragon Age is all about, since I started with Inquisition, I can wholeheartedly recommend Inquisition as well. Also, again, these long-running franchises span a lot of time, but don't have a ton of entries. Didn't get a ton of spin-offs, any of that kind of thing. To that end, a modern franchise in the same vein that is a completely different genre, I would recommend starting with the first game, if nothing else, because narratively they are kind of reliant on each other, is the Uncharted series. I love the Uncharted franchise. I think the fourth game, the most recent game as of to this date, is the strongest mechanically of all of them. But I think getting all of Nathan Drake's story is pretty integral. I think that some of the spinoffs aren't necessary, although I think Uncharted Lost Legacy, which doesn't even star Nathan Drake, it instead stars two, in my opinion, much better characters. I think that one is a good standalone and a good jumping in point as well. But if you want the story of Nathan Drake, you should definitely go back to the first one. In a similar way that you couldn't, it's kind of laughable to say The Last of Us is a franchise, but it is. It has two games that you have to play in order. That game is so narrative heavy, and the narrative is the most important part of that game, I would argue, that you really need to play it in order.
It's clearly designed to be played that way. It's not a jump in and play, here's the latest in our franchise kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think that's what a lot of modern storytelling kind of pigeonholes us to sometimes. I'm grateful that the two recent God of War games kind of do a hard reset on Kratos' story. It's not really a reset. It's just a new story taking place a lot longer after the older games, because I didn't like the older God of War games, but I loved God of War 2016. I think that's right. And I have started Ragnarok, but not finished it. But I think these are much better versions of the character and those games, personally. And so I think a lot of more modern games, that franchises that are more recent, that have started in the last couple of console generations, especially narrative-focused ones, it is harder to recommend, again, the Naughty Dog of it all, since they have done two major narrative franchises. It's harder to jump in anywhere because those stories are so tied to each other. And I think that's okay, too. I think with a two-game franchise like The Last of Us Part 1 and 2, it is worth playing all of it. Some people would argue only playing the first game is worth it. The second game had too many issues, quote unquote. I really like the second game in the same way I like Requiem for a Dream and will never watch it again.
Yeah.
But I think narratively you have to play those together because they really do rely on each other and tell this more or less complete story, flaws and all.
Yeah, it's very much the approach to narrative and experience that different series and studios have. And thinking about this, Some games are like recommending horror movie franchises that have so many entries. And do you need to start with the first Final Destination or the first Saw or the first any of these other movies, or is it about getting an experience? And some would argue yes, and some would argue no. Some more anthology-ish, but also connected series make me think of reading the Discworld books, where there were a lot of them. Every one of them I've read, I've enjoyed, and I love them. But people being like, do I start with the first book? That's almost one of the universal rules of getting into Discworld. Do not start with Color of Magic. Don't. Terry Pratchett, GNU Terry Pratchett, he did not recommend starting with Color of Magic. But because there were certain books that were almost pseudo-sequels or following certain characters within this bigger world, you could be like, all right, I want to read about these witches. I want to read about the City Watch. I want to read about the wizards. I want to read about the Industrial Revolution that went on within the big city or whatever of those. You could just read those, and each of those were anywhere from 2 to 7 or 8 books. And that was more manageable. And characters would show up in each other's books as cameos, or you'd get to see how they're viewed when they're not the main character, which is its own fun thing. I think that also comes up as far as a lot of these kinds of recommendations and situations that we're talking about, Matt, where whether or not something is made to be 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, you must play them, you must know them all, or just what is your experience? Because there again, in engaging with the narrative and gameplay experience, those go hand in hand when playing video games.
Before we wrap up, I do want to put you on the spot for one of the franchises you're most well known for, because I think it's only fair. And also probably one of the franchises to have, I would say, one of the most bug nuts story narratives ever. So
you can start with 3. It's fine.
With Metal Gear, obviously Metal Gear's been running since the Nintendo. The most recent game is Metal Gear Survive, which we don't talk about. But clearly Solid was meant to be a new starting point, right? Obviously that's known of the franchise, but I have heard variety of recommendations. Do you, to be more serious about it, do you think 3 is one of the best places to start in the franchise, or should you go back to 1 and play them number wise in order?
It depends on what people are trying to get out of the series. If you just want to play one Metal Gear Solid game to sort of test the waters and go, do I want to play these games? Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater is an amazing game. It's an amazing game on its own. It does still have a bug nut story. Abso-freaking-lutely. It's something I love about the whole saga, franchise, everything. But it's one that is self-contained. It is a prequel. And thus, they can have some sly references, but you don't need to know them all. You, at the beginning of the game, choose, I liked Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, this is my first game, whatever it is. And they give you little bonuses based on it, little Easter eggs on top of it. I love that. While it is a departure in some mechanics from the previous Metal Gear Solid titles, they'll go everywhere. So I think that is an excellent first entry. If you want to get the story of Metal Gear, if you want Metal Gear. Exactly. If you want that, and you want to be doing that for the rest of your life, you start with Metal Gear Solid. Because, actually, Metal Gear Solid is the 3rd Metal Gear game. It is distinctly, if you were to fully write it out or be honest about it or whatever, it is Metal Gear 3. And there's all sorts of jokes in that. Solid for Solid Snake. Solid for polygons rather than pixels. Solid for Metal Gear 3D. All these things. You can have all kinds of fun with that crap. But there's little bits of retreading narrative ground from the previous 2 games. Because in the States, we didn't get Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake until compilations that came out later. Metal Gear 2 that we got on the NES was a travesty, and absolutely why we had a Metal Gear saga to begin with. It's very funny. It retreads it for the benefit of those that didn't play the previous games, so it does make it a great entry point there. You get the reiterations that you need, and it expands upon things that were just kind of like 1 or 2 dialogue boxes in an MSX game. So cool expansion, great. And it is a refinement of the gameplay. And those retreads also have their own narrative need. And that idea is also explored in Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty. But I would not recommend that as a first Metal Gear Solid game. I think it's an incredible title. I think it does all kinds of crazy things. I also think it's bug nuts and has its problems. But that one is not a great entry point because there's certain pieces of it that rely on you a little bit going, haven't I done this before? It explores the notion of sequels in a way. 4 is that writ large. 5 is actually a really good entry point as well. It's a very different kind of gameplay and is a very different kind of experience. So any of the odd number solids are good entry points based on what you're into. I would say 3 is an incredible game on its own. 1 is a great entry point to Metal Gear. And 5 is a great modern gaming experience.
All right. Now, of course, there are tons of franchises we haven't talked about for a variety of reasons. They didn't fit the criteria. We forgot about them.
We haven't played all of Xenogears, Xenosaga, and Xenoblade, although those are all connected to each other. Xenogears wasn't even meant to be part 1 of the saga. I think it was part 4, part 6 of what was supposed to be a 9-part saga. So these things even jump around.
Yeah, we're making recommendations based on the franchise we've had experience with. That said, I also haven't mentioned Kirby because you can literally play any Kirby game. I think there is not a bad game in that franchise. There are games that are worse than others, but like start with Dreamland, start with Kirby's Adventure. Kirby's Return to Dreamland on the Game Boy Advance is arguably my starting point I would recommend, but honestly, the newest game on the Switch is one of the best games in the franchise. And Planet Robobot, which is currently about to be lost to time on the 3DS. Is probably the strongest entry in the entire franchise. But those games, you're just fighting gods as gods. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, that one, it's more about the gameplay. You get what the world is about and everything within 30 seconds, no matter what your first game is. That's just a matter of, where's a good jumping in point? What do you got?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Totally.
What we're talking about is definitely a little more getting into across the landscape, I guess.
Right. And, there's a lot of stuff we still haven't covered. We didn't cover Doom. We didn't cover Wolfenstein. Tons of stuff we missed. We probably have to do a follow-up on this. But, there are probably franchises you're thinking about that we didn't mention that you wished we did talk about. And if you did, please let us know. Because at the end of the day, this idea was born out of being given a review code for one of my favorite franchises, but it also is spawned out of the recent talk about where to start with stuff like Final Fantasy and Mario, and so I think it was worth discussing. This is going to be an evolving topic as games that only have 2 entries now, if we revisit this in a few years, will have 3, 4, or 5 entries, depending, who knows. And I think it's always worth revisiting because as every new game comes out, and we didn't really talk about this that much, those could be the best new entry point. I would have never recommended the most recent Like a Dragon game as an entry point until Yakuza Like a Dragon came out. Before that, it was 0 or bust. But now that game exists, I feel very differently, though I still edge towards 0. And so that kind of thing is also making a topic like this worth revisiting because as newer entries come out, they could be the best new entry. I would have recommended the first Doom until Doom 2016 came out. Now that is my go-to recommendation. A topic like this is worth continuing to reinvestigate as game companies figure out how to bring in new audiences, which they do with every new entry, whether you think they do or not.
Every entry almost needs to be considered longtime fans, but also someone's first.
Yeah.
And that is a philosophy we carry into everything we do under the banner of fun and games. Every game has the potential to be someone's first. Every game is someone's favorite. And we like celebrating those and recommending those. That's why SideQuest exists. And that's why we talk about these sorts of things. And so, listeners, what are your criteria for recommending games to people? What are some franchises that we have not talked about on this episode or previous episodes that you're like, guys, friends, Matt, Jeff, get into these things? I mean, there's plenty of series that are long running that I don't know where to jump in on them, and I get overwhelmed by choice and would love to be told what's a great entry point on that. What do you look for? Do you look for convenience and accessibility? Do you look for gameplay, narrative, encapsulations, that idea of if you play only one, play this one, or I want you to play all of them, so start with this one? Where do you come from with that? And what are the sorts of games that you've had great success with those kinds of recommendations? We want to hear about it. Please get in touch with us. There's so many great ways to reach out. We are Fun and Games Pod across all the social media that we are on right now: Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, Tumblr. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of this episode. Let us know what you thought of previous episodes if you listened to them, or if this is your first episode and you're going back and checking that out, why'd you do it? Also, let us know who you'd like us to talk with and what you'd like us to talk about in future episodes. You can go to certainpov.com and find links to not only other great Certain POV podcasts, but a permanent invite link to our Discord server where a lot of these conversations continue. If you want to be up to date on everything we're putting out all in one spot, you can check out our Patreon, patreon.com/funandgamespod. You can join as a free member, but we appreciate everyone's support, monetary, emotional, or otherwise. Thank you for that. If you have the means to and want to, thank you so much. And we also want to thank those up on the high scoreboard. And today, the high scoreboard is Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Needon, Luke Lewis, Roger Reichart, Alejandro Alves, Curly Bright, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Robert Prine, and Sean Bowen. Thank you so much for your support. You'll be able to enter your initials during the flashback portion, but that's just kind of to get more people up to speed. I know all of you have been here for a while. Thank you. We're going to get to the gameplay in just a second, okay?
It's funny. I never know whether you think of those bits during, before, or after, but I'm always entertained.
I will leave that a mystery.
And I'm grateful for it. Also, if you're still here, thank you for being here. And please rate us and review us on your podcast platform of choice. We have links down in the show notes to, of course, the Discord server, as Jeff mentioned before, but also to Spotify and Apple to make it really easy for you. Spotify only lets you rate. Apple lets you rate and review. Every little bit helps. Every rating and every single review helps us to get featured so other folks can find this podcast. If you, like us, want this community to grow, please do that. If you don't have Apple or Spotify, but you do have a different podcast platform that allows you to rate and review, Pocket Casts, a bunch of others do it as well, please do it there. It works the same in all those places, and every little bit helps, so we are grateful for that.
Also, thank you, The Barber Who Games, for the recent review on Apple Podcasts.
Gee, I wonder who that is.
Golly gee.
If you have not listened to our most recent episode, as of when we're recording this episode, on the Game Gear retrospective, please go check that out. Also, I think by the time this airs, our voting will be done for the next console retrospective, but I'm very excited because we've got some really good question mark choices in it, and it should be a lot of fun.
You can vote on our Patreon.
Yes.
And whether you're checking out this as your first episode, whether you are a member of the Patreon, whether you are rating and reviewing any of those, we appreciate any and all interaction and just you being here. We couldn't do this without you. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Jeff Moonen.
And I am Attic K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Hey.
Oh, hey, Jeff.
What's going on, guys?
Oh, talking about Superman.
Oh, cool. I could talk about Superman.
I could talk some more about Superman.
We know.
I'll bet a few people would want to get in on this.
I'm down.
You know it.
That sounds like fun. I'll do it.
Cool, let's do it. We can call the show Men of Steel.
And you can find it at certainpov.com.
Or wherever you get your podcasts.
Yay.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.